So our next speaker is Dr. Jesse Owen. He's professor of counseling psychology at the University of Denver. He has over 150 publications in journals, chapters, the author of 2 books, Therapist, Cultural Humility, and Research Design in Counseling. He's been funded by the John Templeton Foundation's Bridge Project as a co-PI of a project investigating spiritually integrative therapy in correctional contexts, a very unique contribution. He is also a co-investigator on 2 federally funded projects. His areas of research focus on psychotherapy processes and outcomes, with emphases on therapist effects, multicultural processes, including cultural humility, and the interaction between techniques and therapeutic relationship. Dr. Owen is editor of one of the APA's top-tier clinical journals, Psychotherapy, previously associate editor for the Journal of Counseling Psychology, Psychotherapy, and Archives of Sexual Behavior. He was awarded an early career award for 2 different APA divisions and is also an APA fellow for contributions to the promotion of psychotherapy, and also a great colleague on our work on virtue and flourishing in mental health care. So we look forward to your talk, Dr. Owen, which is titled Preventing Burnout and Promoting Flourishing, the Roles of Relational Character Strengths. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and thank you to the Peel Foundation for having us here. My colleague Karen and I are going to present a couple different angles on flourishing and burnout, and what therapists and providers can do to help prevent burnout as well as address burnout. So how are therapists doing these days? We can see in a lot of the popular press that therapists are struggling, and therapists have their own mental health needs. We can see a lot of differences among therapists and how burnout comes to be. And we can see the impacts not only on their clients, but also on themselves. And so let's get a big picture overview here. In a recent meta-analysis of over 9,000 therapists, we see this percentage of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, low self-efficacy, and it also relates to worse therapy outcomes. In one study from the UK, we see that burnout actually accounts for about 25% of the variance in therapist outcomes. And that should be alarming to us in terms of what's happening in our field. In terms of the actual impact, this idea of emotional exhaustion is something that a lot of us feel, but it's not necessarily linear. And so when we think about emotional exhaustion, it actually varies throughout the week. It can vary throughout the day. And so how therapists kind of tune into that emotional exhaustion is key. Depersonalization is one of those pieces that has 2 really different angles. It's when therapists start talking about and thinking about their clients in unhuman-like ways, like they're taking advantage of the therapist, or they're treating their clients with language that we commonly use when we don't want to be connected to our clients. So not using person-first language. So for instance, as Steve mentioned, we did a study in the correction in a jail setting in Denver. And when we start hearing therapists talk about their clients as inmates, these folks who are just behind bars, as one therapist said, versus this human being who happens to be living in a correction institution, is a very different way of thinking and knowing that human being. And so how do therapists take care of themselves? And we think about the self-care literature, and how many times have we heard phrases like this: you should take time for self-care. What does that really mean? Right? Like, sure we should. So I want to challenge a little bit of some of these dichotomies that we think about in our world. So I had a colleague who used to say, I don't live to work, I work to live, right? And so phrases like this provide a false dichotomy in my mind. In my mind, work shouldn't be antithetical to living, and living shouldn't be antithetical to working, right? How do we bridge this gap where we are infusing our lives in our work and our work in our lives? Honoring both and cherishing both, I think, is something that we all should be striving towards. I think some of the previous talks today really highlighted the importance of not only just self-care, but community care. What does it mean to be part of a community that cares for one another? How do we connect to each other to provide the care that we need to lift ourselves up, right? Therapy and a lot of spiritual work, it can be very independent, can be very one-on-one, it can seem like something that just happens behind closed doors. And at the same time, we need to think about ourselves as connecting and contributing to a community of conversation, of connection, and of healing. So what does that community work look like? It's going to vary for everyone that's listening to this talk. But if you don't feel like you're connected to a community, that should be a good warning sign that you're going to be more likely to burn out. The other piece is that self-care, in some of our interviews in our most recent qualitative study, really highlight that self-care needs to be distinguished between what we are actually doing to fill our cup up versus what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so I pose the question, what's the difference between living life and self-care? So later on today, Steve and I and a number of the other presenters are going to go out to dinner. Is that self-care? Or is that just us going out to dinner and celebrating, right? When you go out for a happy hour with your colleagues, is that self-care or is that just living your life? So the real question to me when it comes to self-care is we have to think about the needs, the intentions, purpose, and structures that provide us self-care. So what actually do you need to fill your cup? Are you intentional about your self-care, right? When we think about therapeutic interventions, we're very intentional about addressing a specific need. We're very intentional about addressing a certain symptom or promoting flourishing, right? We're doing something intentional. I believe self-care shouldn't be no different, right? That we should be more intentional around what do we need and how are we pursuing our goals. The other piece that has come to light in a lot of our work is the structural issues around self-care. So what kind of structures are in place for you to thrive? It's interesting, in most of our conversations with therapists, it's not about the work with their clients that is kind of pulling them down. It's the structures of where they work. Most people talk about the stressors at work. They don't talk about the stressors of their clients typically. Obviously, we can all think about a client or two that really does push our buttons, hits our countertransference for sure. But a lot of the times, it's about the structures in which we work. My good colleague, Brad Shuck, reminds us constantly that the main predictor of flourishing in work is asking yourself this question: do I feel like I'm being treated with dignity and respect? Do I feel like my voice is valued? If the answer to any of those questions in your mind right now is, well, maybe, then you should really think about, hey, how do I engage a conversation about how do I feel like respected at work? How do my bosses, how do my colleagues treat me with respect or not? And what does that mean for me? So what does it really mean to flourish? So when we think about burnout as one continuum, flourishing being a very different continuum. And so when you think about happiness, ask yourself this question: do you feel happy right now? Do you feel happy with your life right now? How is your physical health? A number of things that we all know about, right? We all know the connection between mental and physical health. But what are you doing to check in with yourself about your physical health? Each week when I teach my professional seminar to my first-year doctoral students, we do a check-in called Mind, Body, and Soul, right? To remind them that it's not just their mind that we're tapping here in our training program, but it's also their physical health. It's also about their soul. And that could be spiritual, that could just be however they define that. But to think through those three dimensions is really important to help promote flourishing. What meaning do you make of your work? And how are you expressing that meaning? Our good colleague Joel Wong talks a lot about gratitude and the power of gratitude. But it's not just being grateful for the things in your life. It's about sharing that gratitude with others. That's the PowerPoint. And so when we think about how do we connect with others to do this work, it has to be, that community of sharing. The other piece to this is that I want to really remind folks that flourishing is not the opposite of burnout. It's part of that continuum. So you can feel moments of flourishing, and you can also feel burned out at the same time, and that's okay. We can hold these two things at the same time in our minds, bodies, and souls. I'm not going to go through all of these points due to time, but we did a grounded theory qualitative study where we asked therapists and trainees both about their experiencing of flourishing and character strengths and what the role of character strengths can do to promote flourishing. And if you look at just even the first one here, flourishing involves appreciating and persisting through the full range of human emotional experience, which facilitates intrapersonal growth and meaning making. This theme that we found in our study is a really true testament to honing in on what we feel in our bodies, as well as understanding that there's a meaning to this. There's a meaning that we can make in our worlds to this experience. I also want to draw your attention to the third point. Negotiating basic needs and systemic barriers lays the groundwork for being able to define one's values within their social cultural context. The keys to understanding the systemic racism that we experience, a lot of us brown and black folks experience on a daily basis, is important to contextualize. It comes at a cost. It comes at a cost when we're sitting across from a client who also microaggresses the therapist. And that's not lost on me, right? It's not lost on the power of how much hurt is happening in the world. It's about the messaging. We also know that if we take a look at social media, one of the biggest changes that's happened in social media is we can equate it back to what's considered the retweet button. The retweet button was not originally designed in the original form of Twitter, but it's made tweets so much more accessible to retweet. If we take a look in the polarization of America in terms of politics, who's retweeting the most are the far left and the far right. And so we're not hearing equally the voices of people where you may be sitting. And so what does that mean for you and what you're exposed to? Karen's going to come up here and talk about cultural fortitude in a little bit. And our work together has really reminded us that there is a layer of character strengths and values that drive us. And we need to hone in on that to really elevate ourselves and elevate the conversations that we're having, that it's not a retweet. It's a deep and defining conversation. I also want to talk about the role of challenge. A lot of the times I hear folks say, well, I'm just too exhausted to do anything more. I can't take more on. And what we see in at least the psychotherapy literature is that therapists over time don't tend to improve. They actually tend to get worse. And so, which is not a very positive psychotherapy finding at all. I wish it was different. I'm just the messenger here, so, and potentially the analyst of some of these studies, but that's okay. But what we see in a recent study is that therapists who actually have patients with higher severity actually do improve over time. And if we think about the work of Csikszentmihalyi, who, if you're familiar with the book Flow, and we think about the states of flow or being in the zone, he suggests, and based on his research, is that we need to be challenged. We need to be challenged at the level of our skill level and just slightly above. We need to be engaged in this work in a way to make sure that we are moving the meter forward. This study, obviously it's just one anecdotal study, but it's of over 600 therapists. We have thousands of sessions in this data set over years. And I think the meaning of this, to me, really highlights that burnout happens and challenge can happen. And if we start thinking about the meaning of our work moving forward, the goal isn't just to take the foot off the pedal, it's maybe to vary it up a little bit, right? If we start to become complacent, maybe that's not the goal. Maybe that's not the answer to burnout. It's something that we should probably continue to unpack and understand in a deeper way, but it's just some musings from a recent study. So Karen and I started a study a few years ago with the support of the John Templeton Foundation. Steve and I are co-PIs on this grant, and we started to ask the questions, how does character strength tie to flourishing and burnout, right? So really trying to unpack some of these dimensions. And so we asked some folks some questions around flourishing. We also asked some open-ended questions, and we also wanted to really kind of tie the bow around relational virtues and flourishing. So far, we're still collecting data. We have a sample of around 80, mainly women, and as you can imagine, the field is more predominantly women and white. And so what are we seeing in terms of early trends? Flourishing is connected to these relational strengths. So engaging in gratitude, engaging in humility, engaging in cultural humility, those types of pieces are connected to our sense of flourishing and our sense of well-being. And some of the qualitative statements we heard participants say, when I'm more content in all areas of my life, physically, mentally, I'm more curious about others, right? So you can think about having more capacity. Flourishing gives you more capacity to connect to others and to give to others. Looking at other people's perspective during a disagreement, right? So this notion of having some humility and having some connection with these relational virtues is part of the puzzle pieces that makes us strong, that makes us grow, and that makes us a better therapist at the end of the day. The last point here is around having a more accurate perception of yourself. We always think that we are open to feedback, and the real question is, how do you know that you're open to feedback? What are you doing in your world to suggest that you're open to feedback? As a therapist, an APA just came out with new practice guidelines around measurement-based care. And measurement-based care, or sometimes called routine outcome monitoring, is becoming more common. Insurance companies are now requiring payers and funders to really push the meter on measurement-based care, including having that one be one of the HEDIS metrics moving forward. So you might see this be mandated, but I hope it's not. But measurement-based care can help us gain some humility, right? That's asking and empowering our clients to give us feedback on how they're doing from week to week and how sessions are going, right, with the Working Alliance or with the humility scale. The ability to engage and use these measures is what we see in the literature is that there's early adopters, and then after about a couple years, people tend to drop off. In one study in Vermont, about 50% of the therapists stopped using measurement-based care after 2 years. The challenge here is to prevent burnout, to know how you're doing, you need reliable feedback loops. And I had one therapist say to me during a training, I don't need these measures, I know how my clients are doing. So the notion of engaging humility, engaging some of these relational strengths where you're open to feedback, where you're actually asking for folks to give you reliable data is part of this process. We see in some studies that there are some therapists that on average their clients get worse. And these are the therapists that are typically not able to identify that they're in this boat. In a recent study, we found there was about 30 therapists or 35 therapists out of, granted, a couple hundred that had 100% dropout rates. 100% dropout rates. And what's interesting in that study, what we see is those therapists actually treat more clients because they have more availability, because their clients never come back. And so when we start to think about how are we doing these feedback loops, how do we know if we're burned out, what are we tracking? And so if you're a therapist listening today, I hope and encourage you to find some metrics that are meaningful for you. Because one of the other issues in measurement-based care is that we know is that if the measure isn't connected to your practice, it's not going to be meaningful for you, it's not going to be meaningful for your client. There's a ton of measures out there, a lot of them that are very, very brief that you can use. But to engage these relational character strengths, to have some humility, to have some connection, and also to give yourself a little bit of forgiveness, right? The self-forgiveness literature, I mean, Steve could talk about this for days, is really, really powerful, right? To give yourself a little bit of compassion around these pieces. The last thing I'll say here, and one of the things that Karen and I are working on right now, is a study looking at what does flourishing and burnout sound like in session. And so we don't know the answer to this question quite yet. We have over 1,200 sessions that we are running through machine learning algorithms to try to figure this out. And if you'd like to join the study, just reach out to me. Shameless plug. But I would say, as a practicing therapist myself, I know when I don't sound right. I know when I'm not there. I know when I'm not engaged with the client in the way that I need to show up. And so for you, if you're sitting there, I encourage you to create a plan. Create a flourishing and burnout prevention plan. What are you doing actively, to go back to intentions, to help prevent burnout? What are you doing actively to help yourself flourish as a therapist? And what would that mean? And lastly, who do you need in your corner to say, Jesse, you need some help, or you need to take a break. You need a buddy who can be truly, truly honest with you, right? So I have Karen Tao on my side where she will say, Jesse, no, that's not right. And when it comes to cultural conversations, she'll be like, Jesse, that's not right. Okay, let's talk about this. But we have that solid relationship where we can have those real conversations. And it goes deeper because I know she cares about me. So as you think through your flourishing and burnout prevention plans, think about the people that you need on your side. And it may not be other therapists. It might be a partner. It may be a friend. It could be anybody in that space. But think about what you need to do action, do intentional actions to promote flourishing and prevent burnout. I would also like to express some gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation, who's funded a lot of our work, and especially on therapist flourishing and burnout. So, thank you all.